disturbance is to look into the growth velocity. So you measure the growth rate of your patient. So this normally varies depending upon the age of your patient. And as you can see in the tabulation, the the high, post or after birth extrauterine, the peak growth rate that we will have would be during the first year of life. So here, your growth velocity per year would be about 23 to 27 centimeters. That's why if you are born, let's say, with a length of 50 centimeters, so at birth, 50 centimeters ka more or less, you are expected to grow by 25 centimeters in 1 year. That's why kung 50 ka nga at birth, ang predicted length mo by 1 year old would be 75. So, whatever your birth weight is, birth length is, I mean, kahit 48 yan, 46, you usually would add 25 to predict the length of the baby by 1 year old. And this will decrease eventually until it again picks up by your adolescent years. So pagdating ng 12 to 2 years old, medyo mag-slow down, 10 to 14 centimeters, on average 12 centimeters in a year. So halos kumalahati na yung growth rate mo or velocity by second year. And then progressively goes down 8, 7, then 5 to 6 centimeters. As we would see later on, ang pathologic growth velocity for short stature would be less than 5 centimeters per year. And you can see here in the tabulation, walang below 5 centimeters per year. So the second peak of growth would be during your adolescent years, puberty. Earlier for girls, 8 to 12 centimeters, and boys would usually grow taller later than girls, but this is associated with a higher growth velocity of 10 to 14 centimeters per year. Di naman during the entire adolescent years mo nag-i-increase ka ng ganong kalaki. No? It's only during the peak growth velocity. So mga limited dyan for 3-4 years lang. Especially for girls, but shorter yung period. So growth disturbances. We go to short stature, and this is the definition of short stature. There is an absolute height that is more than 2 standard deviation below the mean for age and sex. So if you have a percentile chart natin would go from P3 to P90. So yung P90 would represent that kung ikaw ay nasa P90, if there are 10 patients there tapos nandun ka sa P90, 9 of the patients would be shorter than you. Kung P3, almost all would be taller than you. Ganun. A height that decelerates more than 2 growth channels over time. In the example that we had, the growth channels, we would stay in that growth channel. We are expected to stay or mag-deviate lang ng konti. But if you go beyond 2 channels, say you were plotted at -3 in our -1 in our example, and then you went under -3, later on. So pagdating mo ng say 10 years old, 11 years old, nasa negative ka. That's more than 2 channels. Again, that would be pathology. Height velocity, more than 2 standard deviation below for age, and a growth velocity of less than 5 centimeter per year. So kung maka-document ka na, dapat ganito yung growth velocity mo, pero less than 5 centimeter yung nakukuha mo, then that is short stature. And height more than 2 standard deviation below the mean parental height. Another way of assessing growth disturbance is to look at the skeletal age or the bone age. So here, the standard is to make use of the left hand and the left wrist. Only because this is the standard that was made by Dulich and Pyle, Atlas. Kaya yun ang reference natin. So when you do bone age, you request for the x-ray of the left hand and wrist. Kasi baka tanongin kayo ng mga radio tech. Most of the time, when we request for x-rays of the extremity, it's usually bilateral to compare yung symmetry. But in both aging, it's only the left hand. So this becomes pathologic if the bone age is more than 2 standard deviation from the mean for age and sex. And the bone age that it has a predictive value in terms of potential growth would depend if you are male or female. So for males, these are the bones that would give you better predictive values in terms of potential growth. That would be your distal segments of the 5th, 4th, 3rd finger, the epiphysis of the 3rd metacarpal. And for the females, it's the epiphysis of the 3rd, 5th, and 4th metacarpal. The lowest predictive value is with your capitate lunate and hamate. Dental age also comes very handy in assessing growth disturbances because dental age usually would be at par with your skeletal age. And there are factors that will determine dental age: the eruption pattern, the time of appearance of deciduous and permanent teeth. And in the assessment, we can do dental x-rays to look at the status of eruption. So, maaring akala natin delayed ang dentition nila. It's just delayed lang ang eruption, and that we can see in dental aging. So in the picture, I don't know if you can see the very first tooth that would erupt would be your central incisor, and this is usually in the mandibular area. So pag central incisor mandibular, that's around 6 months. And this is another trick that we use in gauging the age of our patients. So pag nakakita na kami ng mandibular tooth, say dalawa siya, may ngipin na siya sa baba, that will tell us that the baby is approximately 6 months old. So if you know the age of eruption, you will be able to predict more or less ano yung magiging age niya. So pagdating ng 1-year-old, dapat may lower and upper incisors na siya. So 4 na yung ngipin niya. So the patient is approximating 1-year-old time. So this algorithm is can be used to evaluate patients with short stature. So if you qualify or you satisfy the criteria for short stature, look for gastrointestinal or endocrine symptoms. If this is not present, you look for dysmorphic features. Ano ba yung mga dysmorphic features? These are gross abnormality, especially facial features. If it is not present, then assess growth velocity, projected height, weight, and bone age. And and kung walang endocrine, walang gastrointestinal, walang dysmorphic features, then you end up with either of the three normal variants of growth of short stature. That is constitutional delay of growth and puberty, or it may be a familial short stature, or the most it may be still an endocrine disorder. So if the patient is dysmorphic, then look if it is proportional or not. If it is not proportional, then evaluate for chondrodystrophy. And if it is proportionate, then evaluate for genetic syndromes such as Down's or Turner's. So, in the event that they have a history of gastrointestinal and endocrine symptoms, then consider diseases like celiac inflammatory disease, hypothyroidism, or cortical excess. So that means you would need the help of subspecialists, especially the gastroenterologists and endocrinologists in those cases. Okay, so growth disturbance can either be primary growth disturbance or a secondary growth disturbance. When we say primary growth disturbance, we usually would refer an intrinsic defect in the skeletal system. So skeletal ang titignan mo lagi doon. Pagka secondary, it is due to factors outside the skeletal system. So you would have to entertain endocrine, metabolic, or even nutritional problems. And for the potential of normal bone growth, of course, kung primary, since the defect is intrinsic, your potential for normal bone growth would be impaired. But if it is secondary and you are able to reverse the process or cure the cause, then the potential for normal growth can normalize. And bone age, primary, not delayed, but if delayed, it is much less than the height for age of the patient. For secondary, it is delayed and to the same degree as the height for age of the patient. So these are conditions associated with your growth disturbances, and we have examples for your primary growth disturbance and your secondary growth disturbance. So primary, skeletal, and then you have the syndromes. Your torch infection intrauterine, because this can cause some malformation. And for secondary growth disturbance, you may have growth hormone deficiency, hypothyroidism, which you will also take up later, your nutritional deficiency, chronic diseases. Here in the example, chronic renal insufficiency. But you can have also secondary growth disturbance in many chronic illnesses. Like if you have also chronic cardiac illness, patients who would have congenital heart disease untreated, they can go into secondary growth disturbance. Or even acquired cardiac diseases. Again, those who have been so symptomatic, like rheumatic heart disease. They can also have secondary growth disturbance. And you have the constitutional growth delay, familial short stature, and idiopathic short stature, which are variants of normal growth. So this is the most common cause of short stature. Any idea? Hindi masyado doon sa mga dysmorphic. It's the constitutional growth delay, the delay in your puberty. So this differentiates the three variants, normal variants of short stature. We have constitutional growth delay, familial short stature, idiopathic short stature, and their characteristics. So, the constitutional growth delay, they are what they call late bloomers in the family. There may be also a history of constitutional delay in the family, and the history of delay in puberty with no endocrinopathy. So pwede mong part of the differentiation from familial short stature, because in familial short stature, your onset of puberty is normal, whereas in constitutional growth delay, puberty may be delayed as well. For idiopathic short stature, there is no identified pathology here, but the patient satisfies many of the criteria for short stature, like absolute height less than P30, your growth velocity normal, but would usually be less than P25 for age, bone age normal but maybe delay, but may have delay in skeletal age and puberty without family history, and they have normal growth velocities. So these are the laboratories that you can do in the investigation of patients with short stature. And the laboratory that you would request will depend upon your main differential diagnosis. So you can probably do skeletal aging, but if you're not entertaining any congenital or genetic problems, then karyotyping may not be requested at all. So if the patient is suffering from probably chronic renal insufficiency, then request for a urinalysis and a BUN creatinine. So that will all depend upon what you are suspecting, kung ano yung mga laboratory kakailanganin natin. So tall stature. So criteria for this would be absolute height that is more than 2 standard deviation above the mean for age. So there, if you plot them in the growth chart, they are way up. Height velocity more than 2 standard deviation. Projected height again more than 2 standard deviation from the mean parental height. So the algorithm for examination or tall stature would be very similar to your short stature. You look for dysmorphic features of your patient. If there is none, as for a recent growth spurt. If this is present, then is there early sexual maturity? Kung meron, that may be due to precocious puberty. But if it is not present, then you evaluate for hyperthyroidism or growth hormone excess. So if there is no recent growth spurt, the projected height more than 5 centimeter of mid-parental height, that is normal. If that is present, then that may be a normal variant, or it may be due to obesity, or if this is not present, then that is probably just a familial short stature. So if this is dysmorphic, then you have the different differential diagnosis that may be diagnosed by your chromosomal or karyotyping. So again, you have the normal variants and the endocrine disorders that may be entertained for tall stature. Pero yung mga hyperthyroidism, say precocious puberty, they may have early increase in growth velocity. However, may just short-lived yung mga growth height velocities nila. Unlike, let's say, with pituitary gigantism, where you have an excess growth hormone. So, other differential diagnoses. So, mga rare conditions naman to. So, good to know. So, disturbances in growth hormone. Growth hormone is secreted in a pulsatile manner and controlled by alternating secretion between your growth hormone releasing hormone and yours and somatostatin. There are irregular surges, and this is stimulated by the release is stimulated by your rapid eye movement, sleep, postprandial glucose decline, normally elevated amino acids, your epinephrine or epinephrine, beta blocker, serotonin, L-DOPA, GABA, impacting your estrogen and your thyroid hormone. So let's look first at growth hormone deficiency. So location would be either central or peripheral. If it is central, then you have the hypothalamus and the pituitary to look at. So the lesions here would usually be hereditary defects, congenital malformation, acquired defects, or growth hormone deficiency may be not defined, like your Prader-Willi and the idiopathic causes. For peripheral growth hormone deficiency, again, you may deal with hereditary defects like your Laron syndrome, which is a growth hormone receptor defect, or it may be acquired, like producing antibodies against your growth hormone or growth hormone receptors. So you suspect growth hormone deficiency when your absolute height is below the first percentile for age and sex, and your height is more than 2 standard deviation below the sex-adjusted mid-parental height. So acute cases of acquired growth hormone deficiency, you may have final height that may be normal, and height velocity is slow in both congenital and acquired. So if you look at your insulin like growth factor 1 and insulin like growth factor BP3, they would be low. And evaluate also your other pituitary hormones, because they may exist with other hormonal deficiencies. So ask for bone age and MRI, especially if you're dealing with cranial or central type of growth hormone deficiency, because you would want to evaluate your hypothalamus and pituitary. So other systemic causes of growth hormone should be ruled out. They would have subnormal growth rate, progressive decline in the growth percentile, delayed bone age, low IGF-1 and IGF-BP3. They would have a poor response to growth hormone stimulation, and these patients may have predisposing conditions like brain irradiation, they may have optic atrophy, and of course, if they exist with other pituitary hormone dysfunctions. So for the definitive diagnosis of growth hormone deficiency, we would have to do a growth hormone provocation test. So how do we do this? Usually this is done with the use of either initially assessing for your thyroid hormone and do a challenge, no? By using your arginine or insulin, clonidine, levodopa, or glucagon. So that would be the provocation in this case. So if that is acute growth hormone deficiency, then the result would be less than 10 nanograms per ml peak of growth hormone in each of 2 provocation tests. So this has a high clinical suspicion of growth hormone deficiency. If this is chronic growth hormone deficiency, then the peak levels of growth hormone will be less than 10 nanograms per ml in each of 2 provocative tests. And they would have suboptimal linear growth and delayed skeletal age. For prepubertal children, you have to do 2 pharmacologic tests. That would consist of a pre-test and another one after the short-term sex steroid treatment. And usually this is by giving your estrogen for 3 days. That is only for prepubertal children. So, as we said, the growth hormone provocation test is used to definitely diagnose growth hormone deficiency, but it can be deferred in times where the expected growth-related findings are present, or there is a documented pituitary or hypothalamic defect, or at least there is another pituitary hormone deficiency that is already present. So in those cases, you may not do your growth hormone deficiency provocation test already, because that would already suggest the presence of growth hormone deficiency. So treatment-wise, of course, this is a deficiency, then we have to give your growth hormone, and it is in the form of your recombinant human growth hormone, and should be started early to be effective, and continued until near final height is attained. The dose is 0.16 to 0.24 milligrams per kilo per week subcutaneously, given in 7 divided doses. But it's not just the near final height that will make us decide to stop your growth hormone therapy. So there are other criteria that would make us stop the treatment. One, if the patient already decides that he or she is tall enough. Two, the growth rate is less than 1 inch per year. So, in spite of the recombinant human growth hormone, you're not really gaining any height that significantly. Or the bone age of the patient, if it is a girl, is more than 14. For boys, it is 16. These ages would correlate with the closure of your growth plate. So, imbis na tumangkad yung pasyente mo, baka mo maging acromegaly na because of the growth hormone that is still being administered after the closure of the growth plate. Growth hormone therapy is a bit expensive. That's why not many can really afford it. And there are also significant side effects that you need to monitor during the time that you're giving the growth hormone. Some troublesome effects would be edema formation, uh, volume or blood volume expansion leading to hypertension, CNS symptoms. So it's not that talagang safe na safe. So when you give the recombinant human growth hormone, monitoring of these side effects would also be very important. So these are other approved indications for your recombinant growth hormone use in idiopathic short stature. We give them in patients with chronic kidney disease, especially before transplantation, because as we know, chronic renal problems would result into short stature. A history of IUGR, SGA that has not demonstrated catch-up growth by 2 years of age. What do we mean by catch-up growth by 2 years? Nakapeg yan ng 2 years. So even if you are small for gestational age, or even if you are a preterm, by 2 years of age, extrauterine, we expect them to be at par with a baby that is born normal. Kaya yung natawag ng catch-up. So by 2 years old, kung ano yung mga parameters expected for a normal baby at 2 years old, that is also what we would expect for a baby who was born with intrauterine growth retardation or was small for gestational age, or even for preterm babies. So Prader-Willi, Turner syndrome, age-related wasting. So these are some other indications for recombinant hormone therapy. However, for Laron's syndrome and primary insulin growth hormone factor 1 deficiency, we don't give recombinant growth hormone. What is given is recombinant insulin-like growth factor 1. So there's the difference. Kung primary IGF-1 deficiency and Laron's syndrome, it is recombinant IGF-1 that is given for these patients. So, we said central IGF deficiency may be caused by problems in the pituitary or hypothalamus. So if there is a documented tumor in this area, then surgery may have to be performed and even follow this up with irradiation. So the other end of the spectrum, hormone excess, hormone excess. So there is an overproduction here of your growth hormone. So if the epiphysis is still open due to the excess in growth hormone, the result is gigantism. If the epiphysis is already closed and still you have excessive growth hormone production, then you have acromegaly. The etiology may be genetic, it may be secondary to adenomas. So your pituitary adenomas would usually be one of the major causes for gigantism. And if you have somatotrope tumors of the pancreas, that is one of the more common cause for acromegaly. Then neurofibromatosis, tuberous sclerosis. So these are secreting adenomas for your growth hormone. So this slide only differentiates your gigantism from that of acromegaly. Major difference would be for gigantism, since the epiphysis is still open, the course is very dramatic. There is a rapid increase in height. Whereas in acromegaly, the the course is more or less insidious. Medyo slow development of the manifestations. So diagnosis, you have a clinical suspicion if your IGF-1 and IGF-BP3 levels are elevated, or you have a growth hormone level that is more than 400 nanograms per ml. But even if you have a growth hormone level of more than 400 nanograms per ml, you would still have to do your oral glucose suppression test, which is the gold standard for the diagnosis of your growth hormone excess. In the oral glucose suppression test, if there is an inability to suppress your growth hormone levels to less than 5 nanograms per ml at any time during a 2-hour glucose challenge, then that is diagnostic. Since we are also maybe dealing with central tumors or brain tumors, then a brain MRI would have to be requested to detect pituitary adenomas. In growth hormone excess, usually the skeletal age is not delayed. So the goals of therapy here is to remove the cause. No? If there is a pituitary mass, then it has to be removed and hopefully restore the growth hormone and secretory patterns to normal. Restore your IGF-1, IGF-BP3 levels to normal, and retain normal pituitary secretion of other hormones and prevent disease recurrence. So aside from this, we have also your biochemical indices of cure, where the growth hormone levels is less than 1 nanogram per ml within a 2-hour period after your OGTT or your oral glucose tolerance test. And your serum IGF levels are within normal range within age for the age of the patient. So treatment for tumors, we might have to do transsphenoidal surgery, which is a treatment of choice for well circumscribed pituitary tumors. However, of course, for neurologic surgeries, the success of the surgery would depend upon the extent or the size of the tumor. And this can be followed up by pituitary irradiation, which may have a delayed effect. And you might end up with multiple pituitary hormone deficiency 10 years after irradiation in 40 to 50% of cases. So you have to remember that when you irradiate, other parts of the pituitary may be involved, and you may end up with multiple hormonal deficiencies. There is also a medical treatment that may be started upon surgical failure to result in a cure, and irradiation does not work fast enough. So we can make use of your somatostatin analogs and growth hormone or growth receptor antagonists. You also can use dopamine agonists for those with growth hormone and prolactin oversecretion. Okay. So we'll leave the growth disturbances and go to your antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone is also ang proper name niyan is what? Arginine vasopressin. Kung minsan kasi kaya tinatanong, nakakalimutan natin yung arginine vasopressin. Ang natatandaan lang natin, antidiuretic hormone. And arginine vasopressin is produced where? Saan ulit? just like our growth hormones, the hypothalamus and pituitary would be very important here in this case. Produced by the hypothalamus and then secreted by your pituitary. So, hypothalamus, pituitary axis lagi yung pinag-uusapan natin. And just like any hormone, by definition, a hormone is what? It's a protein. It's a protein that is produced by one organ, but its action is in another organ. So, yung growth hormone natin, hypothalamus, pituitary, no? But ang effect niya saan? Sa skeletal system. Your ADH, your antidiuretic hormone produced by hypothalamus and pituitary axis secretion, and the action is where? Saan ang action ng antidiuretic hormone? Collecting ducts of the kidneys. Can you imagine the filtration system of the kidney? These are all specialized capillaries in actuality and continuous. Okay. So, nire-review ko lang yung physiology, yung endocrine. What are the actions? So we have to know this para mas maintindihan natin yung discussion later. What's the action of your ADH? Any brave soul? Action niya is to water absorption. So retain water by absorbing water in the collecting ducts, bringing it back into circulation. What's the other action? Na lagi natin nakakalimutan na action pa rin din pala ng ADH. Vasoconstriction. So, these two actions of the antidiuretic hormone is part of maintaining our blood volume and pressure. So, for patients who would have low blood pressure, masisecrete din ng ADH. So, kung contracted ang iyong blood volume, masisecrete uli ang ADH by stimulating our osmoreceptors. So, that's part of the main action. So, it has a lot of function in water homeostasis. And these are just some of the ways by which we lose water. Approximately, we lose about 1.5 liters per meter squared per day. What's a meter squared? What is the body surface area? And how do we measure that? Kailangan maaral nyo na yan kasi magka-clerk na kayo. Alam nyo na kung ano yung BSA. Para pagka minention sa mga conferences, BSA, may idea kayo kung ano yun. Ano ba yung BSA? Body surface area. That is computed based on your height and weight. Height in centimeters, weight in kilograms, divided by 3,600. And then you get the square root. So it's a square root of height, weight, multiplied by the weight divided by 3,600. So of this 1,500. There are obligate urine volume that is lost. So obligate. This is our sensible water loss through the urine. That's about 900 ml per meter squared per day. You lose also insensible water losses. So insensible coming from respiratory, gastrointestinal, and skin. So this all will add up to about 850 ml per BSA per day. So those are the losses. But we also gain about 250 ml per meter squared per day through oxidation of the food that we get. Yung metabolism natin. Product of metabolism would be water production of about 250 ml per meter squared per day. So kung i-add up mo lahat yan, ano mangyayari? 900 plus 750 plus 100 gives you 1,750. Pero yung losses yun, 1,750. Pero nag-gain ka ng 250. That's why we have an average of 1,500 ml per meter squared per day. Now, polyuria, by definition, but of course, this is just one of the definitions. Maraming definition kasi ng polyuria. For our purposes, we'll make use of this. 2 liters per meter squared per day. Are you losing 2 liters of water per day through your urine normally? Yes. Ito kasi meter squared, hindi yan absolute. No? Meter squared yan. Anong average, for an average adult, ano ang average BSA? It's about 1.75. So yung 2 liters times 1.75, what would that give you? Ilan? $3,500? Tama ba ako? 3,500? 3,500. Siguro naman di kayo humihingi ng 3,500. Except if you drink a lot of water. So kung baon mong tubig ngayon na 2 litro, inuubos mo yun, malamang abutin mo yung yung 3,000 liters per day. So that's why I'm saying the definition of polyuria is also relative. This is in pathologic conditions. Ang presumption nito, you're drinking a normal amount of water. So miinom ka ng normal amount of water and yet your urine output is that high, 3,500 per day. Okay, that's polyuria. Or in children, we usually would express it based on ml per kilogram per hour. And that is about more than 5 ml per kilogram per hour. In some books you will see it's more than 10 ml per kilogram per hour as a definition of polyuria. Now, polydipsia, so excessive intake of water. So in this abnormality, ADH, you will hear polyuria and polydipsia. So in times of ADH deficiency, the deficiency may be in a way a real deficiency wherein your hormone is very low or absent. And that is when we have central diabetes insipidus. When we have receptor defects, meaning meron kang ADH, pupunta sa collecting ducts ng kidney, but the receptors there are not responding to it. That's a receptor defect. And that is what we call nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So that's ADH deficiency. ADH excess would be in times where we have the syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion or SIADH. So diabetes insipidus. So primary, so usually central origin, ano? It can be idiopathic, pero ibig sabihin, di ka pa rin nagpo-produce ng ADH. And there may also be secondary causes for central diabetes insipidus, as well as that of nephrogenic and nephrogenic DI, primary and secondary causes. You can just read them through. Pero anong summary ng central? Usually, CNS problems. Okay? Summary ng nephrogenic DI, usually receptor problems. Pupunta ka ngayon sa kidney para makita mo yung mga receptor problems. So, clinical manifestation. So, even if this is central in origin or nephrogenic type, the general signs and symptoms would be the same. Pareho sila. They would have polyuria and polydipsia. And the polydipsia is reactive. Reactive na yan. And we are talking about here, patients who are able to get their own water supply. Pero pediatric yung pinag-uusapan natin. And DI, central or nephrogenic, can occur in the very, very young. So yung very, very young, say baby, makakakuha ba ng gatas niya or tubig niya on their own? Or a patient, kahit na adult, who is bedridden, baka walang polydipsia kang makuhang history because they are unable to get their own water. But the polyuria will still be there. So there is hyperthermia, weight loss, collapse. Babies would cry excessively, prefers cold water, vomiting, constipation, root failure, enuresis in a previously dry child. So yung mga bedwetting na new occurrence, part of the differential would be diabetes insipidus. They do not perspire, dehydrated thing, and they may have, there is recurrent and uncontrolled hypernatremic dehydration in early infancy. And this can lead to brain damage and mental retardation. So, the very young is very, very much at risk for this complication, or those patients who are debilitated. Now, so what do we see in diabetes insipidus? Again, what is the function? It's to reabsorb water and for vasoconstriction. So in a patient with diabetes insipidus, anong makikita natin dyan? These patients would be in a state of hyperosmolality. Taas ang osmolality, serum osmolality. And in a state where they are unable to concentrate urine. So, normal. Ano ba yung normal serum osmolality natin? What's the normal? And how do we compute for serum osmolality? Any idea? Usap tayo ng serum osmolality pero wala tayong basis for looking at it. Serum osmolality is computed in several manners. You can approximate serum osmolality by multiplying your serum sodium twice. So that's a rough estimate. So wala kang ibang parameter but you have serum sodium multiplied by 2. And you have an approximate of your serum osmolality. So average 140 serum sodium. Multiply it by 2, that's 280. And true enough, ang serum osmolality natin, normal, would range from 275 to around 290. That's about normal. But if you're more into the computation of serum osmolality, you have to request for your BUN. You have to request for your glucose. So 2 times sodium plus glucose plus BUN. That's how we compute for your serum osmolality. Okay. So hindi siya makakoncentrate ng urine or diluted o ma-dilute yung urine, pala. So if this is deficiency, hindi mo ma-absorb yung tubig, so saan siya napupunta? Sa urine. So you have an increase in urine volume and you are unable to concentrate. So diluted yung urine mo. What is the urine osmolality range normal? So you can go as low as 50 to as high as 1,200. So normal yun. That's the normal range. So diluted, very, very diluted urine would be about 50. Very concentrated urine would be about 1,200. And the same things that we make use for serum osmolality computation is also done for urine osmolality. Kaya lang, dinadagdag dito potassium. So urine sodium, urine potassium, your BUN, your CREA, or BUN or urea plus the glucose. Okay. So, if that is the case, and you have this serum osmolality, the patient who is polyuric and polydipsic, that is suspicious already of diabetes insipidus. But you do not know if this is central or nephrogenic. And this is where your water deprivation test comes in to differentiate between central and your nephrogenic DI. So you do the water deprivation test. That means you get the serum osmolality and and urine osmolality of the patient plus your ADH levels initially. And since this is water deprivation, you could not give any water to these patients. If this is really diabetes insipidus, this is done as an inpatient. You do not do this as an outpatient because you need to monitor this patient closely. Kung talagang GI yan, in a matter of a few hours, that patient may die without any intervention, without water. Because what will happen if you deprive these patients with water? Anong mangyayari? Anong mangyayari sa serum osmolality? Ihi ka ng ihi. Wala ka naman iniinom. You get dehydrated. Your serum osmolality goes up. Pataas ng pataas yun. And what will that do to your cells? Ang taas ng serum osmolality mo. What will that do to your cells? You have an intracellular compartment. extracellular compartment mo, very concentrated, what happens to water movement? From the cell, it goes out. So what happens to the cell? It shrinks. All the cells in the body would shrink because of that. However, what is significant? Of all of the cells in the body, what would be very significant as far as symptomatology is concerned? It's the brain cells. So pag nag-shrink ang brain cells, it can actually tag on blood vessels, especially the middle meningeal artery. And you can have intracranial bleed that can cause initially probably headache, hypertension, kasi mag-i-increase ang intracranial pressure, and death of your patient. Very dangerous yung water deprivation test. And you need to do is to do this inpatient. So pagkatapos mo makuha yung initial parameters mo in doing your deprivation test, you now administer your desmopressin. So what is desmopressin? It's an antidiuretic hormone. So if this is central, what happens? What happens to your serum osmolality, urine osmolality? Nandiyan na yung sagot eh. Kung central, ano mangyayari sa serum osmolality na mataas? Bigyan mo ng desmopressin, water now is going to be reabsorbed. And so, your serum osmolality goes down or increase. Kaya tayo nalagay ko dito. Anyway, correct na lang natin kung mali. Ano mangyayari? You are now reabsorbing water from a serum osmolality that is high. So you will expect the serum osmolality to go down. Mali nga ito. Baliktad, no? Baliktad yan, ha? Baka pag yan ang sinagot nyo, hindi ko tatanggapin. Sinabi ko. So just understand what happens if you give a desmopressin. So there is now a hormone that will act on your collecting duct, and the collecting ducts now will absorb water. So the serum osmolality should go down. Okay? The reverse will be true for your serum and for your urine osmolality. Mas makakoncentrate ngayon kasi mas kukunti na yung lumalabas na ihi. If this is nephrogenic DI, if you give your desmopressin, what happens? This is an inherent defect of the receptor. So regardless of the presence of hormone, wala pa rin siyang action. So if it is, the serum osmolality is high, it remains high in this case. And it would now be low in case the concentration of the urine would still be low. Okay? So disregard nyo na muna ito nasa ano, ha? Just remember the action of your desmopressin for your ADH in this case. So what would be the treatment for diabetes insipidus? For here, majority would have to be given adequate fluid and caloric intake. So for patients, especially those who will not be able to get hold of their water on their own, you have to give water every 1 to 2 hours during the day and 3 times at night to prevent hypernatremic dehydration. This is especially true to the very young. And avoid excessive solute content, especially salty foods. Choose food and milk with the highest ratio of caloric to osmotic load. Uh, so in central diabetes insipidus, there is a deficiency of your ADH. So you need to give your desmopressin. It's a drug of choice that can be given by nasal insufflation or by tablet. And very rarely do we give parenteral, the piperacin. This is reserved for post-operative comatose and patients who have suboptimal intranasal use response. So treatment for diabetic nephrogenic diabetes insipidus, the principle of giving water and calories would still be there. However, hindi desmopressin na bibigay natin dito because we know that even if you give a hormone, replacement hormone for this, doesn't act. It would not have any effect. What has been tried is to give your thiazide diuretic, chlorothiazide. Di ba counterintuitive? The patient is already polyuric, tapos bibigyan mo ng diuretic. Parang mali. If you're going to look at it. But the mechanism is explained by the fact that thiazide decreases overall urine output by inducing a state of mild volume depletion. That would enhance your sodium excretion. So kung marami na yung sodium excretion, this will, at the expense of water, mas mapakonserve ang water, it will decrease glomerular filtration rate resulting in proximal tubule water and sodium reabsorption. That will cause significant reduction in fluid intake and voiding frequency. So the polydipsia and the polyuria eventually will decrease because of the induced mild volume depletion by your thiazide diuretic. And this has been the mainstay for nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. So this nephrogenic diabetes insipidus is not a primary defect mismo, but a secondary one. Then you treat and eliminate the cause. And hopefully, ma-reverse lahat yung symptoms. Other pharmacologic modalities would be the use of indomethacin plus aminoride combined with your thiazide or high-dose DDA-VP plus indomethacin for those with genetic defects of the V2 receptor where there is a reduced binding capacity for ADH. Indeed, here, binding capacity reduced. So you give your desmopressin or your DDA-VP. You bombard this with a hormone and hopefully increase the binding capacity. Rational. Kaya high dose siya. But this is expensive. So complications, especially for the very young, mental retardation, growth retardation, and prognosis-wise, for primary type, of course, this is a lifelong disease with good prognosis if hypernatremic dehydration is avoided. You need to do genetic counseling, and for secondary types, that will depend upon the resolution of the cause of the disease. Now we go to excess. This is syndrome of inappropriate ADH secretion. So here the plasma levels of ADH is inappropriately high as compared to the normal with respect to serum osmolality. So hindi siya nagre-respond dun sa normal shut-off of your ADH release because the serum osmolality is within normal. There is no low blood pressure in this patient and yet your ADH secretion is high. For some authorities, they would characterize SIADH as a reset osmostat. So mas sensitive siya. Kahit medyo mababa pa yung levels ng osmolality and normal ang blood pressure, naka-on siya. Puproduce siya ng ADH. So there is a continuous water reabsorption by the collecting ducts and progressive dilution of serum osmolality. Now here, we have the reverse that is happening. So, anong mangyayari dyan? Continuous water reabsorption. What happens now to your serum osmolality? It is supposed to be low. No? So you now have the reverse of our initial scenario earlier. You have a intracellular compartment, extracellular compartment, where the extracellular compartment now has excess water content. So where does your water go? Intracellularly. So lahat ng cells natin overhydrated. But again, peculiarly, ang symptoms natin, CNS. Dati nag-shrink. Ngayon, nag-expand. Lumobo siya. And lahat tayo matigas ang ulo eh. No? If you have a brain that expands against a rigid container, what happens? That's why we have CNS symptoms for SIADH. So, mag-i-increase ang intracranial pressure mo again in those cases. So, etiologies, inappropriate secretion from its normal hypothalamic source, or there may be a secretion of peptides by neoplastic tissues that would mimic ADH activity. Most common cause would be excessive desmopressin administration in the treatment of central diabetes insipidus. So other etiologies, as you can see in the etiology here, SIADH na naman ang involved. Many of these would be CNS problems. It may be an infection, it may be a tumor, it may be a trauma, even psychiatric disease. Pwedeng mag-cause ng SIADH. So, SIADH diagnosis, as I would always say, because there are so many that will cause SIADH, you will need a high index of suspicion. So you have a patient who would manifest with hyponatremic symptoms. Ang symptoms niya, hyponatremia. That is with the over water supply of the brain. You have CNS manifestations. If this is unexplained, and if this occurs in these settings, kaya pag kami may encephalitis, meningitis, tapos hyponatremic, we always would entertain SIADH. Gumagaling na yung pasyente mo, biglang nag-seizure ulit. Baka SIADH yun. So you investigate. So this is hyponatremia without dehydration or oliguria. So your patient has a normal skin turgor, the blood pressure is normal. So sabi natin kanina, one of the stimulus for SIADH release, ADH release or vasopressin release would be a low blood pressure, but in this case, the patient's blood pressure is normal. And there are manifestations attributable to the magnitude of hypotonicity and rate of development. Now, the rate of development here is very, very important. If the rate of development is slow, these patients may not have any symptoms at all. But if the rate of development is fast, then you get the patient more symptomatic. So what do we mean by fast? Ano yung period usually? This is usually less than 48 hours. development. But if the hypotonicity is insidious and develops for several days, unti-unti, usually we adapt to this and we do not develop any problems or manifestations. Again, the manifestations, non-specific, nausea, vomiting, anorexia, irritability, seizure, stupor, coma, all CNS manifestations. So, SIADH ang pinag-uusapan pero CNS ang manifestations. These manifestations, if you look at any book discussing hyponatremia, yan ang makikita nyo. So the same manifestations as hyponatremic, symptomatic hyponatremic patients. So this has to be ruled out. This rules out the diagnosis of SIADH if the serum osmolality is less than 100 milliosmoles per dl. Okay. Diluted yan eh. Kung less than. So diagnosis can be established by looking at these parameters and excluding other conditions that will give rise to the symptoms. So you have to look into have to request for serum sodium, urine osmolality, your urine sodium, your potassium chloride, uric acid, in this case, and exclude other organ system problems. So, sa diagnosis of SIADH, there are things that you need to include, there are things that you need to exclude. So you exclude other conditions causing symptoms, because symptoms of hyponatremia with serum hypotonicity causes maybe varied, maybe renal, it may be adrenal, it may be thyroid function disruptions. So how do we treat? If you have identified the cause, and this is secondary SIADH, then you treat the underlying cause. But the main mode of treatment is to restrict fluid. You have a patient who is hypotonic, ibig sabihin maraming water content sa body. So fluid restriction has to be implemented, strict fluid restriction. So 1,000 ml per meter squared per 24 hours. So you can peg it at that. Or you can be more strict by monitoring your sensible water loss. You can get your urine output for 24 hours and restrict your insensible water loss to around 300 to 500 ml per meter squared per day. Kung ayaw mo yung tedious work na ganun, na ine-measure mo yung urine output at saka ine-estimate mo yung insensible water loss, you can go with 1,000 ml per meter squared per 24 hours. Pero kung talagang strict fluid restriction, take note of your insensible and sensible water losses. Now, slow correction of hyponatremia. In most cases of SIADH, fluid restriction alone corrects the hyponatremia. And if they are not symptomatic, you need not correct the hyponatremic state. Ibig sabihin, we don't give sodium to these patients anymore because the fluid restriction can correct this. And in the event that you decide to correct the hyponatremia, this is corrected slowly. So the meaning, you try to increase your serum sodium level the maximum of 12 millimoles per day. Ano ibig sabihin nun? Ano ang serum sodium level natin normally? That's 135 to 145 millimoles per liter. In hyponatremic state, they can even go down to 115, 110. So we have a limit of 12 millimoles per day increment increase. Meaning if you are starting off with a level of 115, the highest desired level that you would want in 24 hours would be 127. That's still hyponatremic. So you need to go to 127 back to 135 the following day. Say 127 to 135 is no longer a 12 millimole shift, jump. No? So pwede na yun. Okay, so hemodialysis or even peritoneal dialysis may be done. Pero certain to we do this, it's only reserved for very severe, life-threatening situations. Okay, so we leave your arginine, vasopressin deficiency and excess, and we go to thyroid problems. So acquired hypothyroidism. Among the causes of acquired hypothyroidism, autoimmune thyroid disease is the most common cause of acquired hypothyroidism. Anything thyroid ang may problema, in most cases, females. So lahat na makikita natin dito, the ratio is always in favor of the females than the males as far as thyroid is concerned. And they are usually also seen during the adolescent, o mga peak nila, adolescent years. So there are, these are the acquired causes. So mga autoimmune pathology. On top of the list is Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which we will go into later. You have the Williams syndrome, can be caused by drugs, hepatitis C infection, and even occur during post-viral illnesses, neck irradiation, iodine excess, and even iodine deficiency, and post-surgical resection, so acquired hypothyroidism. So for this acquired hypothyroidism, they may have deceleration of growth, decreased growth velocity, which is usually the first clinical manifestation. May have myxedema, constipation, cold intolerance, delayed or precocious puberty. They may have goiter. Goiter is just enlargement of the thyroid gland. It does not connote that if you have a goiter, hypothyroid ka. It can also occur in hyperthyroid patients. So it's just merely describing enlargement of the thyroid gland. Growth retardation, delayed bone age, and if the acquired hypothyroidism, of course, happens later in life, this will not affect school performance because it's only in congenital hypothyroidism that you end up with mental retardation. So, a clinical phase in acquired hypothyroidism where transient symptoms of hyperthyroidism may be present is known as your acytotoxic phase. This is because of the release of your thyroid hormone during an autoimmune insult to the thyroid. or an insult to the thyroid. So may preformed ka na doon eh. And because of the injury, you release this suddenly. Then from hypothyroidism, you have transient symptoms of hyperthyroidism. So diagnosis, you request for TSH and your T4 and do a bone age. For primary acquired hypothyroidism, you expect them to have low FT4 and high TSH. And for secondary or tertiary acquired hypothyroidism, then again you have low T4, low or normal TSH. So treatment, you give thyroid hormone in the form of your levothyroxine and monitor the TSH every 4 to 6 months and 4 to 6 weeks after any dosage change. So for children less than 3 years old, also monitor your T4. From prognosis-wise, all changes revert to normal with treatment, except of course if you're hypothyroid. Yung normal dito would be the symptoms. But of course, you become totally dependent on this, especially in cases of surgically removed thyroid. So, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. This is an autoimmune thyroiditis, which is the most common cause of thyroid disease in children and adolescents, and the most common cause of acquired hypothyroidism with or without a goiter, with a female to male ratio of 4 to 6 is to 1. So this is also the most common cause of goiter in childhood and adolescence. And more common after 6 years and then peaks during your adolescent years. Hashimoto's thyroiditis, or is chronic lymphocytic thyroiditis, is an organ-specific autoimmune disease characterized by lymphocytic infiltration of the thyroid leading to thyromegaly. So organ-specific, it's just the thyroid that is being attacked by your autoantibodies here. So your thyroid antigen autoantibodies that may be present are enumerated here. Your thyroid peroxidase, thyroglobulin, thyrotropin receptor blocking antibodies, and even your pendrin antibodies may be present in this chronic lymphocytic thyroiditis. So again, to emphasize, organ-specific siya. So growth deceleration and goiter, which is the most common clinical manifestation. The thyroid is diffusely enlarged, fair, non-tender, and may be asymmetric in 30% of cases. Most cases are clinically euthyroid and asymptomatic. And some have clinical symptoms of hypothyroidism. Others are clinically euthyroid, but with overt signs of hypothyroidism on laboratory tests. So clinically normal, but there are manifestations laboratory-wise. Some with signs of thyrotoxicosis or the Hashi-toxic phase, which we mentioned earlier. Thyroid function tests are often normal. Subclinical hypothyroidism are seen with your F3, often normal, but TSH may be elevated, with demonstrable presence of your autoantibodies. So thyroid scintigraphy and ultrasound are usually not indicated in this case, and thyroid biopsy will give us a definitive diagnosis, but this again is rarely clinically indicated as well. So treatment, you give your sodium L-thyroxine in overt hypothyroidism, those with low T4 levels and the high TSH. For euthyroid patients, no treatment is necessary, but observation and monitoring should continue. Antibody levels would fluctuate in both treated and untreated patients and may persist for years. And disease in some cases is self-limited, hence periodic re-evaluation is necessary, especially when growth and sexual development is complete. The other end is hyperthyroidism, where you have synthesis and excretion of excessive thyroid hormone from your thyroid gland. By definition, thyrotoxicosis is any state of excess circulating thyroid hormone and its clinical manifestation regardless of its source. Hyperthyroidism is commonly due to your Graves' disease, which is again an autoimmune disorder, which is the most common cause of pediatric hyperthyroidism, with the peak incidence during your adolescent years. And again, female to male ratio in favor of the females, 5:1. Majority of cases will present with a family history of autoimmune thyroid disease. So, this is an autoimmune disease, but in contrast to Hashimoto's or the chronic lymphocytic thyroiditis, which is organ-specific, this is more or less, it would involve other organ systems. So you may have enlargement of the thymus, the spleen, lymph nodes, other than the thyroid, due to infiltration of the lymphocytes and plasma cells. And even the retroorbital tissue may be infiltrated. So the plasma cells in the thyroid would produce your thyrotropin receptor stimulating antibodies that will bind to the TSH receptors that stimulates your cyclic adenosine monophosphate production. And the effects of these CAMPs would be analogous to your TSH, leading to thyroid hyperplasia and unregulated thyroid hormone synthesis. Graves' disease is also associated with your ophthalmopathy because your thyrotropin receptor stimulating antibodies would bind to the orbital fibroblast and extraocular muscles, stimulating the synthesis of your glucosaminoglycans and cytokines. So, the clinical manifestation may develop gradually, 6 to 12 months between the onset of the disease and the diagnosis. It is longer in prepubertal children than in adolescents. And remission rate is longer in children than adults. The earliest signs would be emotional disturbances and motor hyperactivity. And the most common sign would be the symmetrically enlarged thyroid. So here with the Graves' disease, because they are hyperthyroid, schoolwork suffers because they have it results in a shorter attention span. So you have these clinical manifestations of Graves' disease or hyperthyroidism: nervousness, polyphagia, tachycardia, palpitation. You have proptosis if the extrusion of the eyeball is less than 18 millimeters, and it is known as exophthalmos if the extrusion is more than 18 millimeters. They are also prone to fractures because of bone resorption and low bone density. And there is acceleration of your growth velocity. That's why this is one of the differential diagnoses for tall stature. But they would have advanced age. So a thyroid storm is an extreme and dreaded form of hyperthyroidism characterized by an acute onset of hyperthermia, severe tachycardia, restlessness with rapid which rapidly progress to congestive heart failure, arrhythmia, delirium, coma, and death. And there are precipitating factors like physiologic stressors that is related to trauma, infection, surgery, or even radioactive iodine treatment. So there is a diagnostic criteria and scoring that is available. This is part of your assignment. So hanapin niyo yung diagnostic criteria and scoring for thyroid storm. Diagnosis, of course, your T3, T4 are elevated with low TSH, elevated radioiodine uptake. Your thyroid scintigraphy will have an elevated uptake diffusely throughout the gland. And your thyroid stimulating immune globulin assay would be as well elevated in this case. And this assay replaces our actual measurement of your thyroid tropin stimulating antibodies because this is not available. So yung TSI ang nire-request natin. And the disappearance of your TSI also would denote remission of your patient. So which means you need to monitor this as you treat patients with hyperthyroidism. So medical-wise treatment, you give your thionamide drugs, metimazole. So this also addresses your ophthalmopathy. So it would suppress the levels of your TR stimulating antibodies by directly affecting interthyroid immunity. And there are adjunct medical treatment for hyperthyroidism. One would be your propranolol. This would address the adrenergic manifestations of your thyrotoxicosis like your tachycardia and hypertension. It may impair the peripheral conversion of your T4 but does not alter thyroid function or exophthalmos. Another adjunct medical treatment would be your radioiodine, which is trapped inside your follicular cells, which will lead to destruction. It is relatively safe. So one of the fears before was we are using a radioactive medication for children who are actively growing, but it has found out to be okay for children as well. Though it is not used as a first-line management, since full effects can only be seen in 2 to 3 months. So delayed ang kanyang resolution if you are only giving your radioactive iodine. Part of the treatment may involve surgical removal of your thyroid. It may be a total or subtotal thyroidectomy. And this should be performed when the patient is already euthyroid. We've noted in the thyroid storm, one of the stressors there would be surgery. So if you do this during the hyperthyroid state, then you can end up with a thyroid storm that is detrimental to your patient. So these patients before surgery must be on anti-thyroid drugs for 2 to 3 months. You can also give your saturated solution of potassium iodide, 1 to 3 drops twice a day or 3 times a day for 7 to 14 days prior to surgery to decrease gland vascularity. This is very important because you can decrease the blood loss and blood product replacement for your patient. So, since this is total or subtotal thyroidectomy, the patient becomes hypothyroid post-op. So what would that mean? Thyroid hormone replacement kaagad after surgery. Now, surgery before would be open surgical treatment, but now they have what they call a minimally invasive approach. So you don't see any neck scars anymore, even after total thyroid. So there are disadvantages and disadvantages of the different modes of treatment. So for surgery, one of the complications may also involve laryngeal nerve damage and hypocalcemia, because your parathyroid gland sits behind your thyroid gland, and it can inadvertently be removed during surgery, rendering your patient hypoparathyroid, leading to its complications. Prognosis-wise, with treatment with methimazole, clinical response is seen 3 to 4 weeks after, and adequate control in 3 to 4 months. However, they may have relapses that can occur 6 to 12 months after stopping treatment. In these cases, you need to resume anti-thyroid drugs or give other therapy like your radioactive iodine. So remission rate is 25% after 2 years, 30 to 50% after 4 to 10 years of your anti-thyroid drug treatment. So habang tumatagal, tumataas ang remission rate. But we would have to educate our patients for the possibility of relapses. So these are predictors of early remission. Those with high BMI, males, age of onset more than 13 years old, a small goiter, and a modestly elevated T3. Graves' ophthalmopathy remits gradually and independent of hyperthyroidism. And severe ophthalmopathy would require either high dose of glucocorticoids, orbital radiotherapy, or even surgery. And avoid discontinue cigarette smoking, because this has been associated with relapses in patients with Graves' disease. So, thyroid carcinomas in children. This is rare, but also peaks in the adolescent age. The prevalence of thyroid nodules is greater in adults, but the risk of malignancy is higher in children. So mas maraming nodules sa adults, but if the child would have a nodule, the risk for malignancy is higher. Children with thyroid cancers would have higher rates of metastasis and recurrence, but with indolent course and favorable outcome if with adequate treatment. So among the cancers, it's papillary CA that is most common, followed by your follicular and medullary CA. And only papillary and follicular CA would respond to adjunctive therapy and TSH suppression. So clinically, thyroid CA would manifest as a painless nodule in the anterior neck. So that would be the usual progression. You have to examine the cervical nodes, because this is the most common area for metastasis of thyroid CA. But for distant metastasis, the lungs would be at the most risk. So all of these patients with thyroid carcinoma, almost all, would be euthyroid. And there are risk factors associated for thyroid carcinoma like radiation, female gender, puberty, past medical or family history of a thyroid disease. So diagnostic-wise, by physical examination, you might be able to notice the thyroid nodule. And the thyroid nodule can be cystic, it may be solid. And to distinguish between cystic and solid, you can do an ultrasound. And usually cystic formation would be less likely to be malignant. So if it is solid, it turns out to be solid in your ultrasound, the presumption is always that it is malignant. Surgeons would do fine needle aspiration. It may be an appropriate method for diagnosis. So they just insert a big bore needle and aspirate through the tissue and send this for cell histopathology and see if you can identify any malignant cell here. For the advocates, they would do that. For those who are not so much into fine needle biopsy, they would prefer open biopsy of your thyroid. Ang kanilang reservation here is that you might miss the area where malignancy is present, especially in early stages. You can also do a radionuclide scan, and this can distinguish between a hot nodule from a cold nodule, which only means that if this is a hot nodule, this is a hormone-producing area. So functional yun. Cold nodule, non-functional. But between hot and cold nodules, what is usually associated with malignancy would be the cold nodule. Although hindi mo pa rin masasabi tiyak for sure that this is malignant just based on a radionuclide scan. So you would still need either a fine needle biopsy or aspiration or an open biopsy for that. So once diagnosed to be thyroid carcinoma, the primary therapy would be surgical resection, either near normal or total, near total or total thyroidectomy. Then you have neck ultrasound prior to surgery to assess for abnormal lymph nodes. This is done prior to surgery to plan out how extensive resection and dissection of the neck would have to be. Adjunct treatment is by TSH suppression and radioactive iodine therapy. Usually the outcome is excellent, but can recur years or decades after the initial presentation. So, for thyroid carcinoma, lifelong monitoring has to be done. So from, say, adolescent siya, usually now in pediatrics, those patients who would have to have prolonged monitoring would have to be endorsed to the adult physician. This is what we call transitioning of the adolescent nowadays. So you have to do that para continuous care. So you need to monitor for your serum thyroglobulin. This is sensitive and then a specific marker. Monitor for your thyroglobulin antibodies to rule out Hashimoto's, and do serial neck ultrasound of your patient. Okay, I think that is the last.